In 1938, Astonishing Science Fiction would publish a novella written by John W. Campbell Jr. under the pen name Don A. Stewart that would go on to inspire what is today widely regarded as one of the greatest examples of science fiction horror ever created. The story, of course, was Who Goes There?, which followed a group of scientists in Antarctica as they desperately try to survive being trapped with a shape-shifting alien entity from another world. The astonishing tale would be adapted for the screen by Charles Lederer for RKO's 1951 film The Thing from Another World, directed by Christian Nyby, although variously reported as actually being primarily filmed by producer Howard Hawks, and starring Kenneth Tobey, Margaret Sheridan, Douglas Spencer, and James Arness as the titular Thing. The film would be a box office success, outperforming other genre classics of the year such as The Day the Earth Stood Still and When Worlds Collide. The Thing from Another World, while a loose adaptation of Campbell's story, would go on to greatly influence the genre and help cement the template of the protagonists coming from an almost exclusively military, science, or journalistic background, and a romance between an officer and a female scientist, which would be a staple of the vast majority of 1950s sci-fi classics. Despite its mass appeal and groundbreaking themes, this first adaptation took a huge amount of liberties with the source material, such as inventing a whole new cast of characters, changing the setting to the Arctic, and most obvious of all, featuring an alien being with almost nothing in common with its novella counterpart. While the book had a certain level of mystery and suspense, owing in no small part to the shape-shifting nature of its insidious protagonist, the film version amounts to little more than a vampiric plant monster, much more similar to Frankenstein's monster than to the formless eldritch horror created by the mind of John Campbell. Although unquestionably a masterpiece in its own right, the 1951's Thing from Another World went down a very different path than the original story, which meant that an opportunity to create a more faithful adaptation was always on the table, and decades later, massive advancements in the field of filmmaking, particular achievements in special effects, would make this dream a reality. Fast forward to the mid-1970s, and producers David Foster and Lawrence Turman first pitched a proposal to take another shot at adapting Who Goes There? To Universal Pictures. Universal was interested and obtained the rights for the project from Wilbur Stark, a producer, writer, and director who had bought up the rights to a number of old RKO properties, including The Thing from Another World and Cat People, which would also get a remake the same year as The Thing, starring Natasha Kinski and Malcolm McDowell. In exchange for the rights transfer to Universal, Stark would receive an executive producer credit on both films upon their release in 1982. Although John Carpenter was first approached shortly after the rights were acquired in 1976, being a little-known independent filmmaker at the time, the studio began potentially looking at one with a more recognizable resume, with their first pick being Tobe Hooper, who was still riding off the success of his seminal genre masterpiece, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and was already working under a contract with Universal. Despite the initial intent to recreate the novella's themes of mystery and paranoia as a result of an attack of an unknown shapeshift alien entity, Hooper and Texas Chainsaw writer Kim Henkel instead devised their own take that would see a character known as the Captain hunting a giant alien creature in the Antarctic, essentially a retelling of Herman Melville's Moby Dick. While this might have made for an interesting film, it had little if anything to do with Who Goes There, which was the job he was being hired for, so the studio and basically everyone involved with this version soon parted ways, and a string of directors and writers were brought on board, including John Landis, who would later go on to make An American Werewolf in London. Without a script or director firmly in place, the project went on ice for the time being until 1979. That's when Ridley Scott's classic science fiction horror film Alien would revitalize interest in the project. Seeing rival studio 20th Century Fox reaping the rewards of not only Alien but also the enormous success of Star Wars just 2 years prior, as well as United Artists' successful remake of another 1950s sci-fi classic, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Universal again saw the potential for The Thing and sought to revive the project. Quite a lot had changed in the filmmaking landscape since their initial pitch, and while Carpenter had been seen as a nobody in 1976, by 1979 he was anything but, following the massive success of 1978's Halloween. and the 2 follow-up projects he would make in their interim period, 1980's The Fog and 1981's Escape from New York. Of the directors courted by Universal, Carpenter seemed to be the one that truly understood the assignment.
Carpenter is considered by many to be the leading filmmaker in the field of terror and suspense, a reputation earned by his previous features Halloween, The Fog, and Escape from New York.
The Thing, the first movie, was always one of my favorite films. It was pretty much directed by Howard Hawks in 1949 or 50. And it was based on a short story called Who Goes There? And which happens to be one of my favorites. And I thought, when they offered me the remake of The Thing, rather than remaking the original film, I thought I'd go back to the short story, which I felt was never done, and do something really entirely different.
Although Carpenter was well aware of the task and had a vision about how he wanted to see it through to completion, he was also understandably wary of tackling another writing project after having just finished Escape from New York, as well as an early, ultimately unused draft for the Philadelphia Experiment. Instead, Bill Lancaster was brought on board after giving a brief pitch that planned to closely mirror the story of the original novella. Despite this, Lancaster was forced to make some alterations as he felt the original story lacked action and was bogged down with an excessive amount of characters, 37 to be exact, while the film version would reduce this number to just 12, which was decided would make the story much easier for audiences to follow. He also tweaked some of the characters, especially the lead character of MacReady, who was transformed from a meteorologist in the original book into a helicopter pilot in the film. Lancaster's ultimate goal was to create a film where no one was the obvious heroic protagonist. Instead, the lead would emerge as the events transpired, and in doing so, he also decided to eschew the flashback narrative format of the original story as well, instead opting to begin the story just prior to the onset of first contact with the alien entity. After completing 4 drafts, Lancaster and Carpenter decided on a final script. Earlier versions of the script had kept the Thing much more hidden, instead relying on pure dread and suspense to progress the story. However, special effects designer Rob Bottin, confident with his abilities to portray something truly unique and horrifying, convinced him to give the various creatures a much more visible role in the final film. While Campbell's original story ends with the humans clearly prevailing over their extraterrestrial opponent, albeit worried that a flock of birds flying away from the base might be infected, Lancaster's original ending idea was to have both MacReady and Childs be infected. Later that spring, the duo would be rescued by a helicopter crew and taken off base to spread the infection across the entire world. However, this concept was rejected by Carpenter, who instead wanted to have both characters choose to sacrifice themselves by freezing to death in the cold, thereby preventing the possibility of spreading it to the mainland should one of them be infected. The final film, of course, would close with an iconic, ambiguous ending that would keep audiences guessing and attempting to interpret for decades to come. Casting for the 12 members of Outpost 31 began in early 1981 and would lead to a number of interesting twists and turns before landing on the final cast we know today. For instance, Carpenter initially insisted that Donald Pleasance play the role of senior biologist Blair. However, it was later determined that he had become too recognizable, especially after his other recent roles in Carpenter productions, which was a problem as the studio was looking to cast an unassuming everyman type who would be easily forgotten when he disappears for a large chunk of the film. Eventually, then unknown character actor Wilford Brimley would land the role. The station commander Gary had a similar situation with Lee Van Cleef, Powers Booth, Jerry Orbach, and Kevin Conway all being considered at one time or another before Donald Moffat finally got the part. For the role of the assistant medic Palmer, a character who seems to have been written to be much more of a comedic personality in earlier drafts, the studio seemed dead set on casting a comedian, considering Jay Leno, Gary Shandling, and Charles Fleischer, before eventually it was decided on David Clennon, as it was determined he was able to perform the much more serious aspects of the character much more believably. Richard Mazer actually tried out for the part of Gary as well, but opted to instead play the role of the dog handler Clark. A big part of the role had him working alongside Jed, a Vancouver Island Wolf-Alaskan Malamute mix, who would later go on to portray White Fang in Disney's 1991 film and its 1994 sequel, Myth of the White Wolf, before passing away at the age of 18. The role of Childs was offered variously to Jeffrey Holder, Carl Weathers, Bernie Cassie, and Ernie Hudson, who very nearly got the part before Keith David was chosen instead. David, who had primarily worked as a theater actor, initially found adjusting to film to be difficult, but was able to cope with the help of his co-stars, and would later go on to have hundreds of credits in film, television, and voice acting, including starring alongside Roddy Piper in John Carpenter's 1988 sci-fi cult classic They Live. The last cast member to officially be signed on was actually there from the very start, helping Carpenter with fleshing out ideas for the project, which of course was none other than Kurt Russell, who had just finished filming Escape from New York and had previously worked with Carpenter on his 1979 Elvis biopic, and would go on to do 2 more films with him, with 1986's Big Trouble in Little China and the 1996 sequel to Escape from New York, Escape from LA. Carpenter was initially hesitant to cast Russell again, and a huge array of other actors were suggested for the part, including Christopher Walken, Jeff Bridges, Nick Nolte, Sam Shepard, Tom Atkins, Jack Thompson, Brian Dennehy, Chris Christopherson, John Hurd, Ed Harris, Tom Berenger, Scott Glenn, Fred Ward, Peter Coyote, and Tim McIntyre. But when all of them either turned down the role or weren't right for the part, he finally decided to just cast Kurt Russell for the role, later proclaiming that it helped having a lead that he knew he could rely on and wouldn't balk about the difficulty of filming, as the entire production was filmed in frigid conditions either in Alaska, British Columbia, or at the Universal lot, where the outside temperatures was a sweltering 100 degrees Fahrenheit while the indoor sets were maintained at a constant 28 degrees. The crew bus nearly plummeted off a cliff en route to the Canadian filming location, while the main set was built near Juneau, Alaska, so snow was at times so heavy that filming had to be frequently postponed. To make matters worse, the day before Keith David was supposed to begin filming, he broke his hand in a car accident, and despite showing up for work the next day, was forced to go to the hospital and had to wear a specially modified glove for many of his scenes in the film. The cast also found it incredibly difficult to work in the numerous special effects-laden scenes, as it was one of the earliest examples of a film where the effects work would be added in post. So Carpenter had to convey to them what they would be seeing, as in reality they were just acting with an X marking the location of the creature a majority of the time. For the score of the film, Carpenter insisted that Italian maestro Ennio Morricone compose for it, even flying out to Rome to meet with him, as he wanted to have a European approach. In the end, Morricone created a variety of orchestrated, synthesized, and a combination of the two, as he was unaware of what exactly Carpenter wanted. He completed around an hour of music, however only about 20 minutes of which made it into the actual film, as Carpenter later determined that a majority of it just didn't fit with the sequences in the film, and instead Carpenter himself spent a couple of days composing some electronic pieces to fill in the gaps. Anyone who has seen The Thing will tell you that the real star of the film is unquestionably The Thing itself, and the multitude of effects techniques that were utilized to make it a terrifying reality. The vast majority of these were created by Rob Bottin, who had previously worked on the 1981 werewolf film The Howling, and as the special effects makeup artist for John Carpenter's previous film The Fog. At the time of filming The Thing, Bottin was only 21 years old at the start of production and put himself through such a rigorous schedule, working 7 days a week for nearly an entire year, literally living in the studio, that after filming was completed, he was actually admitted to the hospital for exhaustion, double pneumonia, and complications from a bleeding ulcer. He would later go on to work on such other staples of the genre as Legend, RoboCop, Total Recall, Mimic, Deep Rising, and more recently, even Game of Thrones. The effects were achieved using a myriad of materials, including KY jelly, cream corn, mayonnaise, and microwave bubblegum. It was Bottin's idea to portray the Thing as a number of varied alien organisms, citing that the creature had assimilated creatures from across the cosmos prior to its arrival on Earth, and could use elements from any of them in its present form, hence the abilities shown in the film, such as having the stomach that transforms into a toothed maw, or having spider legs and eye stalks sprout from a severed human head. Many of the designs came to Bottin in dreams, which he would later record and show Carpenter through sketches he would make. Although Carpenter thought many of the ideas were weird, he never rejected any of them. At one time, Bottin commanded a crew of 35, which he found to be extremely stressful, eventually bringing on some help to assist him, including Eric Jensen, whom he had worked with on The Howling, and Stan Winston, who helped create the dog thing in the iconic kennel sequence. One of the more complicated sequences involving Copper getting both of his arms severed by the Norris Thing's stomach mouth was accomplished using a double amputee who was fitted with fake prosthetic arms made from jello, wax bones, and rubber veins. Initially, the final confrontation with the huge Blair Thing was to be done via stop motion performed by Randall William Cook using a miniature set. However, Carpenter was unconvinced and scrapped all but a few seconds of the footage, and instead an enormous puppet was used that required 50 people to operate. Universal initially set the budget at $10 million, with just a paltry $200,000 being set aside for the special effects budget. But as it became increasingly apparent as to the sheer scope of the production, this would increase to $750,000, and then finally $1.5 million, with a total production cost of $15 million. Corners were cut to save costs whenever possible, so some of the more elaborate sequences were removed completely, and the Norwegian base was made from the repurposed American base set after it had been destroyed by the crew. Additionally, the Norwegian cast shown in some of the photographs were portrayed by members of the crew. A number of sequences were cut by Carpenter in post to tighten the film and remove too many dialogue scenes, which he felt slowed the flow and pacing of the film, and multiple endings were filmed as the bleak ending proved unpopular with test audiences. But after more upbeat ones were only slightly better received, the decision was made to return to the ending Carpenter wanted in the first place. In the end, from start to finish, filming for The Thing took around 12 weeks, beginning in August of 1981. The Thing would be released on June 25th, 1982, opening in 840 theaters and pulling in just $3.1 million its opening weekend, finishing behind Poltergeist, which at the time had been in its fourth week, finishing its debut in 8th place. By the end of its theatrical run, it would pull in a grand total of $19.6 million, making it the 42nd highest grossing film of the year. Although the box office for the film was middling at best, the real crippling blow would come from the scathing reviews it would receive by a majority of critics at the time. A common theme was that many critics found the film to be boring, poorly paced, and complained about the gory effects taking precedence over the plot and characters. Roger Ebert said it was little more than a gross-out movie, citing his major complaints as being plausibility and superficial characterization, and that was one of the more generous reviews. Others called it bleak and nihilistic, and others went so far as to disparage it further, calling it junk, and Vincent Canby of The Times called it the quintessential moron movie of the 80s. Many complained about the characters, pacing, and story. Special effects were generally praised for their quality, but were also a source of ridicule from others as adding nothing more than gross-out shock value. Carpenter himself was quoted in 2008 as saying, "I take every failure hard. The one I took the hardest was The Thing. My career would have been different if that had been a big hit." The movie was hated, even by science fiction fans. They thought that I had betrayed some kind of trust, and the piling on was insane. Even the original movie's director, Christian Nyby, was dissing me. In fact, Nyby, whose actual level involvement in the 1951 film is debated even today, said this of Carpenter's film: "If you want blood, go to the slaughterhouse. All in all, it's a terrific commercial for J&B Scotch." Kenneth Tobey, who played Captain Patrick Hendry in the original, targeted his criticism at the effects work, stating they were so explicit they actually destroyed how you were supposed to feel about the characters. They became almost a movie in themselves, and were a little too horrifying. Few reviews focused on the general themes that have gone on to make the film such an endearing classic, such as paranoia and the fear of betrayal within the community. The growing tension and suspense that builds as the film progresses was given little, if any, mention at the time, and sci-fi magazine's Cinefantastique would later go so far as to print a cover of The Thing with the headline, "Is this the most hated movie of all time?" The reason for the critic and audience reaction at the time may have come down to several factors, one being an oversaturation of the market with horror and sci-fi films, especially in the immediate aftermath of the popularity of Alien. Another being that, judging by the incredible success of E.T., which was released just 2 weeks prior and decimated The Thing at the box office, audiences at the time seemed to be wanting something more optimistic and hopeful. The backlash to the box office disappointment was swift, as Carpenter lost a great deal of credibility with studios and was removed from being the director of the adaptation of Stephen King's Firestarter. Ironically, Carpenter's next film would be an adaptation of another Stephen King work, Christine. He would continue to make films throughout the 1980s and all the way into the 2000s, many of them being masterpieces in their own right. But as he himself admitted, The Thing's failure had a major effect on the trajectory of his career after. Additionally, the man whom Universal had gained the rights from, Wilbur Stark, sued Universal over what he saw as being improperly credited and not acknowledging his contribution to the script, which was refuted by screenwriter David Foster, who stated that Stark had no involvement at all in the actual production of the film. The public's condemnation of the film seemed to be absolute, but as fate would have it, history would have other plans for The Thing. Despite being a commercial and critical failure by nearly all accounts at the time of its release, The Thing would later go on to be reevaluated and praised by many as one of, if not the greatest remakes of all time, and a shining example of the sci-fi horror subgenre. So how did it go from being the supposed most hated movie of all time to be considered one of the greatest? Turning point came in the immediate years after its theatrical release as the movie made its way to television and began to amass a much wider audience. By the early 1990s, publications were already beginning to change their opinion of the film. In 1992, Australian critic Peter Nichols stated a black, memorable film that may yet be seen as a classic. And in the years that followed, that is exactly what happened. By the late 1990s, it was being hailed as a cult classic, and with the advent of the internet and rise of numerous websites and online critic sites, more and more voices would be added to its chorus of praise. Today, it regularly appears on top 10 greatest sci-fi or horror lists, being called the greatest horror film of all time by the Boston Globe, and number 2 by Bloody Disgusting, being narrowly beaten out of the top spot by 1973's The Exorcist. By the early 1990s, the popularity was already being seen with a number of comic book sequels from Dark Horse Comics, beginning in 1991 with the series called The Thing from Another World, so named to avoid confusion with Marvel's Fantastic Four member also called The Thing. The story picked up shortly after the events of the original film, with the character of MacReady returning as the lead protagonist as he and Childs are rescued and continue their battle with the Thing, this time involving an Argentinian base. This 2-issue miniseries was followed by a second, longer series titled The Thing from Another World: Climate of Fear, where the Thing manages to make its way to Argentina's mainland, realizing MacReady's worst nightmare. This run of the story would conclude with the third series and least well received of the three, The Thing from Another World: Eternal Vows. Later, another unrelated limited series, The Thing from Another World: Questionable Research, would also be released. Following this final series of comics, no major Thing media would appear until 2002 with the arrival of the PS2, Xbox, and PC video games simply titled The Thing. Released to roughly coincide with the 20th anniversary of the film, the game again serves as yet another rebooted sequel picking up after the events of the original film, with the player taking on the role of Captain Blake, a US soldier sent to Outpost 31. The player also has the ability to order several computer-controlled characters, which allows for an interesting fear-trust system which emulates the paranoia theme of the film. Additionally, John Carpenter, an avid proponent of video games as a means of storytelling, lent his voice and likeness to the project, in addition to William B. Davis, best known as the cigarette-smoking man on the hit series The X-Files. The game was generally well received, and a sequel was initially planned, but later cancelled as a result of financial complications with the developer Computer Artworks. As praise and interest in Carpenter's film continued to increase due to the widespread use of the internet, Universal itself began to reevaluate it, and in 2009, Variety reported that a prequel was in development. Producers Mark Abraham and Eric Newman, fresh off the success of their remake of Dawn of the Dead, began to look into Universal's library for another potential success, and settled on The Thing, but insisted upon making a prequel telling the story of the Norwegian camp scene in the 1982 film as opposed to a direct remake. The film was written by Eric Heiserer and starring Mary Elizabeth Winstead, Joel Edgerton, and Ulrich Thompson. Filming began in March of 2010 with Alec Gillis and Tom Woodruff Jr. of Amalgamated Dynamics handling the practical effects work, as the film was initially intended to be done almost entirely using such methods as a direct homage to the 1982 classic. Nearly everything would be ultimately digitized over, much to the overall detriment of the film, which would also lead to many fans of the original outright hating the prequel. The Thing was released on October 14th, 2011, and much like its predecessor, was a financial and critical disaster, grossing a worldwide total of just $31 million on a budget of $38 million. One of the biggest complaints being the film seemed more like a rip-off of Carpenter's than a true prequel, with many characters strongly resembling those found in the 1982 film. Additionally, it has been criticized for its over-reliance of CGI over practical effects, which had initially been replaced as it was determined that the original amalgamated dynamics effects seemed too outdated, which of course ironically was the point of making an homage to 1980's practical effects masterpiece. As with Carpenter's film, perhaps time will judge the 2011 film more kindly. However, as of the time of this recording, this sentiment continues to ring true with the majority of critics and fans of the 1982 film. Following the failure of Universal's prequel cash-in attempt, it seemed as if The Thing would once again go back into the ice, never to be seen or heard from again. However, in 2018, an extremely unlikely event would happen that would once again thrust the franchise back into the spotlight. While rummaging through a box of old manuscripts at Harvard University, biographer Alec Navala-Lee stumbled across a complete novel-length version of Campbell's Who Goes There entitled Frozen Hell, which was published the following year by Wildside Press. This new version of the story, released 81 years after the original novella, adds an additional 45 pages, and has since been picked up for a film adaptation by Blumhouse, which will likely involve John Carpenter in some capacity, as has been done with the studio's recent Halloween films. The legacy of The Thing has been a wild roller coaster of a ride, from its initial release 40 years ago to its widespread praise today. Initially seen as little more than a mindless gore fest, it is today viewed as a pinnacle of the genre, a masterpiece of spine-tingling suspense, and one that has directly and indirectly influenced dozens of films since, and will no doubt continue to do so for many more years to come. Hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, thanks for watching.